Well, thank you, Ross, and it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I want to make a few statements by way of a preface. The people I've come to know and respect in Lac-Mégantic, or Mégantic for short, know that I'm doing this, and they trust me to tell their story, and so I bring their greetings. And the second thing I'd like to say is that I'm a big supporter of railways. I'm not a railway person, except my grandfather was a conductor on the New York Central, and I worked a summer on a ballast gang, the CP ballast gang. But you know, working in the policy field with a policy research institute most of my career, I came to understand that array of policies that kind of gained ascendance in the 80s and affected not only in the rail sector but in others. And so when it happened, I mean, I was, you know, completely shocked. I couldn't believe it was happening so close to home. Lac-Mégantic is a small community, 6,000 people, right on the edge, southeast corner of Quebec, right on the border with the state of Maine. So that's where it's located. And just to give you, mentioned, you know, kind of reiterate some of the numbers about the tragedy. They don't begin to tell the story. But there were 47 people died, and because a lot of them were young people partying at a nightclub, 27 kids were orphaned. It was also the largest land-based oil spill in North American history. And it just incinerated the town center. Listen, I support a strong and a vibrant rail system. I think we can get a lot of that stuff off the highways and onto the tracks. And I also support a strong, independent regulator that has the first and foremost obligation to protect its citizens. I want to say as well that the railways in North America are a highly integrated industry, both in terms of ownership, in terms of regulation, you know, and there is kind of, they kind of work together. There's kind of a harmonization. NAFTA has kind of advanced that, and there are mechanisms in the new NAFTA which intensify that harmonization, and to the extent that it occurs and to the extent that people have access to it, you want to see that going, you know, towards a higher common level rather than the other way around, and too often it has gone the other way around, and especially in the story that I tell about the lead up to Lac-Mégantic and the aftermath and right up to the present. It's a story of regulatory failure, and it's a story of corporate criminal negligence. It's a story of policy decisions, regulatory decisions. It's deregulation accelerated by policies of, in our case, privatization, because CN used to be a publicly owned railway, and austerity, all driving this process, which saw systematic erosion of safety protections over decades. And I tracked that process to the point where it really set the stage for a series of events that ultimately was a question of Russian roulette. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when, and a question of where. Obviously, there was a boom in oil by rail, both back in shale and coming from Alberta, from the tar sands, bitumen. You know, for example, I think 9,000 carloads in 2009 in the U.S., 415,000 in 2013. And a similar trajectory. I know from having done the arithmetic, there was In Canada, there was one dangerous goods inspectors for every 14 carloads in 2009. In 2013, it was 1 in 4,500 carloads. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this growing danger and a sense of willful blindness on the part of the government of the time and on the part of the industry, which is saying, oh, well, you know, we've got this growing danger, but we've got it under control. All the regulations that need to be there are there. And so that is kind of the lead up, and a number of things happened. First of all, the refinery on the East Coast bought a shipment of Bakken crude, high volatility product. In the end, a few cars were taken off. By the time it got to Montreal, it's about a 2,500 mile from Newtown, North Dakota to the East Coast where it was headed. By the time it left Montreal, I think there were 72 cars, and they were laden, probably overladen with that product. Of all of the things that happened in that year leading up to it, probably the most negligent, the most egregious regulatory failure, regulatory negligence, was that this company that was hauling, it was a short line company that was actually was formed. Ed Burkhardt was his name. I don't know if how well known he is, but he was a kind of a smaller version of Hunter Harrison, who really pioneered with Canadian National the precision railroading formula, which then he applied to CN. Then he retired, and then he was called back in 2012 by a hedge fund in New York that saw the potential in terms of share appreciation, that it was highly undervalued. So he brought back Hunter Harrison. Hunter Harrison applied his magic. I don't know if that's the right word, but it certainly was magic in boosting share prices. And CP had a lot of track in North Dakota, like BNSF, and so that was part of the deal. So this short line railroad that CP partnered with probably shouldn't have. He should have partnered, because he could have got to the East Coast with CN, but this one was much more profitable for CP. It had a terrible safety record. Ed Burkhardt had done the same kind of thing that Hunter Harrison did with CP. It cut staff, cut equipment, cut maintenance, and track was in terrible shape, and multiple safety violations that were not corrected. But this railroad was given permission in 2012, the first in Canada, hauling dangerous goods with a single crew member. It basically got permission in the spring of 2012. It began hauling large amounts of Bakken shale in November, and the tragedy happened in July. So it was really a question of Russian roulette. When was it going to happen? I mean, people in the communities along the road just, these trains just appeared, and they were just shocked, and they started contacting the transport department, and they tried to communicate with the railway, which was famously uncommunicative and uncooperative, even with city council members. Ross mentioned the Swiss cheese model, and it's ironically the defense lawyer, and I'll talk about the criminal trial in a minute, but the defense lawyer actually in his closing arguments used the Swiss cheese model to show how much went wrong, and if only this, and if only 2 or 3 or 4, and I think I went through about 15, and I could have gone longer, of if only he had been able, if only the lead locomotive wasn't defective, had a faulty repair, was surging and spewing oil and slowing down and took 10 and a half hours to get to the destination of about 6 miles from Lac-Mégantic that night, the night before at 11 o'clock at night. You know, if only that had been taken out of the lead position. And it wasn't, and the people, it was basically run from across the border in Maine. And they, you know, for cost reasons, if only he had been allowed to set the automatic brake on the cars. He was not. If only, I think it was Jim that mentioned ECP brakes. If only John Risch said there were some ECP brakes, electro-pneumatic brakes, wouldn't have happened. The cars wouldn't have piled up the way they did and punctured and exploded. So there were a lot of those holes in those Swiss cheese pieces, upright pieces. If I had a PowerPoint, I'd show you that would work. If only one of them had been there, it wouldn't have happened. So, you know, he left the train at 11 o'clock at night, or 11:30. He was communicating with the RTC, and the RTC said, well, we'll leave it till morning, we'll deal with it in the morning. This is the engine problem. So he leaves the train, and minutes after he left the train, it started to burn. There was a fire. There was a fire. It was reported by a passerby. The firefighters came. They tried to put it out in various ways, and then they pushed the red button on the side of the locomotive, and the train locomotive was shut down. And in shutting down the train, because he'd set the independent brake, was one part of the air brake system, and he'd set handbrakes, and that was holding the train no problem. But there was a problem with the independent brake off. And by the way, he had to park this train on the top of the hill. There's a very steep slope that goes from that location into the town of Lac-Mégantic, because it's in a basin by a lake, and this is on a hill, so it's a steep slope. And he couldn't park it on the flat because it was being rented out on the siding, which had a derail. Couldn't do that. Couldn't park it on the mainline flat because it was too long, but it blocked a road. So you can see how all of these factors were just stacked against the locomotive engineer. He was informed by the rail traffic controller of the fire that it was put out, and he said, "Can I go back? Can I go back?" And he said, "Look, Tom, just stay in your motel, because you have to start early in the work-rest rules. You're going to be hauling cars west." And so he says, "I got someone else." But there was hardly anyone else, and it was summer. And so he found a track guy, but the track guy didn't fully understand what the consequence was of turning off that it was the only part of the braking system that was allowed to be applied. So in any case, about an hour after it was shut off, it started to roll. And about 1:15, about 15 minutes later, it derailed in the center of town, and it was going at 60 miles an hour. And so the cars just piled up, as I said, they piled up and they punctured and they exploded and burned and exploded. And I don't know if you know, but Netflix has been using footage from that disaster for Bird Box and the Travelers. As you know, portraying a nuclear, because some of those kind of reached the Hiroshima level, or you know, at least in the same, the multiple blasts. So it was just an incredibly intense, you know, fire. If it had happened, you know, an hour earlier, the town, it was a balmy summer night, and it's a tourist town as well. And there would have been a lot more people out on the walks, but as it was, there were still a lot of people in the nightclub, and that's where most of the deaths occurred. Just in the aftermath, and I mean, both the Canadian and U.S. regulators were kind of shocked. Here was this major breach of public safety and a shattering of public confidence, because you know the people people at that nightclub, I mean, the last thing on their minds was this imminent danger 6 miles away. Their view was that, governments take their safety seriously, and they take measures to protect their citizens. But so they had to, they went into high gear with measures, improved safety measures, and ensuring the public that they've learned from this, and that measures were in place, and the whole kind of raft of measures were put in place. And I can tell you at the same time, the industry was there very intensely, and what they were doing was making sure that it didn't get to the point where it was really cutting into their costs. So the intensity of the lobbying in the 3 months after the tragedy was higher than at any 3-month period from 2010 to 2015. So they were there to, either to block or to delay or dilute or reverse where they could. So it did limit kind of the extent. I mean, I could go into the measures that were put in place, certainly right after, within days after, the Department of Transport in Canada prohibited single-person crews. They knew it was a factor, and they prohibited it, and they are still prohibited in Canada. But because of the nature of the tragedy, it's hard for me to imagine that the railways, maybe they're pushing behind closed doors, and as I say, they both work together. But I haven't heard any kind of sign that that this is afoot. And basically, there are an array of safety gaps, whether they're problems with fatigue management, whether there's securement problems, whether they're emergency response issues, the strength of the tank cars. There was a tank car derailment in Iowa last June. They were the state-of-the-art model. They were the retrofitted version of the design that was developed after Megantic to ensure that these cars didn't puncture. And so it was obviously still a problem there. And kind of at the root of it, I mean, you need to have a regulator that's a countervailing force to the industry, and work together where they can. But the industry is in there to make money for its shareholders. Its bottom line considerations. The bottom line considerations for the regulator are the protection of the public. So to have the resources and the mandate to do the necessary oversight is essential. And I've pointed out ongoing safety gaps, and that the window is still open for history to repeat itself. And for me, putting the story together, I just want to, before I say that, let me go back to where the buck stops on this, because it was a blame game situation right from the start, and the last link in the chain was the locomotive engineer. And in the end, about a year later, 3 frontline workers were charged. No one in a decision-making power, no executives, no board of directors, the owner was not charged. So three frontline workers were charged. The trial lasted about 4 months. There was no one, that was, with one exception, that came across the border, executives to testify, although they were subpoenaed. No decision maker in the Department of Transport, but the people that did testify provided a lot of useful information about the nature of the failures. And so when they were acquitted, then you have a situation where no one has been held accountable, going on 6 years. And my friends who are active and watchdogs and activists and monitoring rail safety are calling on the Canadian government to hold a judicial inquiry. I mean, the only venue where people have been obliged to testify in public under oath and be cross-examined was in that trial. That's it. Well, everything else was settled behind closed doors. I could talk about, I'm getting to the end of my time, I could talk about the civil suits and the settlements there, and there were some penal cases against violations of the Rail Safety Act and the Fisheries Act, sort of environmental, but they were mainly fines, but they were all settled behind closed doors as well. So that's kind of where they're putting their one of the places they're putting their efforts. They're always walking the tracks. They've managed to get a government commitment to have a rail bypass around the town. My God. If you see the town now, 4 or 5 years after, it's still one big open desert. Nothing has really been done, and the track goes right through. Who wants to build there? Until they get the bypass done, I don't think there'll be very limited reconstruction. It's all been, and so you have this historic railway town that doesn't exist anymore, and you have a deeply, deeply wounded community, if you can imagine. The consequences and the PTSD, which afflicts most of the people in the town, the majority of the people are suffering from that. So it is, and as I said, they're just amazing stories of courage and refusal to be crushed beneath the wheel, so to speak. And what I wanted to do, and I'll end on this note, is just to provide a record, because when the cameras go away and memories fade, you know, that's people think, oh well, it's been taken care of, and they lose track of the causes, and yeah, oh yeah, company self-regulation kind of gets forgotten as a cause, and then they forget, and it happens again. And so I wanted to try to produce something that will at least be a reference point and will help for all of you who are fighting to ensure the safety of your communities and your workers, that it doesn't happen again. So thank you very much.
Before I wrap up here, I just wanted to hammer home the point that you made about precision scheduled railroading, and that was sort of maybe the genesis of some of these safety failures, I guess, in my opinion, and I think you'd probably agree.
Yep.
Precision scheduled railroading, it's kind of a misnomer. It's neither precise nor scheduled. It is, quite simply, it is the motivation to increase shareholder profits. That's all it is. It's a short-term cash grab at the expense of the long-term health of the railroads and the safety of our communities. And Iowa today is less safe because of precision scheduled railroading. I mentioned the 5 Class 1 railroads. Of those 5 Class 1 railroads, all of them but one operate under this precision scheduled railroading philosophy, and it is definitely to the detriment of the safety of our workers and the safety of our communities. So anything we can do to lift that up and highlight the things that happen under precision scheduled railroading are the closing of car shops that do the maintenance and repairs on cars, the closing of diesel maintenance facilities that do the repairs on the locomotives. It's trimming track maintenance budgets and manpower so that there's less track inspection and so on and so forth. You get the idea, and all that is just to pad the profit margins for these rail carriers. So with that, if people have any questions for Bruce, and I guess Jim, myself, my counterpart here in Des Moines, John Todd Hunter, will be available if you have any questions for any of us, or just want to grab a cookie. I appreciate everybody being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it for me?
Yes, it's for you.
Okay.
Well, it's actually kind of a quasi-question.
We can all weigh in, right?
Oh, I work for Smart Transportation, the
Okay.
National Legislative Office. So
Yeah.
I mentioned John Rich, that's who
Yeah,
I work for. And after this event, I do public opinion research.
Okay.
Try to help with our two-crew legislation at the state and the federal. And one of the things I found interesting was a few years we decided to ask the question to the general public, how many people do you think operate a freight train? Now, we know the correct answer,
Yeah.
normally two,
Yeah.
and then don't know would be another one, so how would the public
Yeah.
know? And what I found with that question was that about 50% of the American public thinks there's a crew of 4 or 5 that operates a freight train, not 2, much less 1. And then when you go through the process, you see like 85% of the people want at least 2. But it was the whole idea that they think 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And I wonder what kind of that perception of that, if that impacts moving forward on stuff about how many people they think operate. I know
Yeah,
it's not
yeah,
exactly-
I would be, I don't know, if you want to weigh in, my immediate reaction was, I'm sure it's, if you did a similar poll, you'd get a similar result in Canada. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. How long ago was it when there were 5-person crews? So, you know, that was their understanding, and, you know, many people are kind of imbued in the history of the railways, that railways are an iconic part of our heritage, our founding and history as a country, as well as your history. And so that's what, you know, there's a conductor, there's a brakeman, my uncle was a brakeman. So I think that, you know, that perception, it must be shocking when they learn, for many people, that it's only 2, and if they learned what some of the railways were up to, and reducing that to 2, and having driverless trains, you know, there'd be an uproar in communities. They would be blocking the rails on trains carrying dangerous goods. I don't know your view on that.
No, it's interesting, I guess, that the public thinks that there are 4 or 5 people on a train. And I think that speaks to our need to educate people on what exactly happens in the railroad industry. And actually, my time up here, I've been up here 7 years, one of the things that actually surprised me most is how little people really know about the railroad industry. For example, when I have gone around and promoted crew van safety legislation, I cannot tell you the number of times I was asked, why are you guys in vans? You know, they don't realize that not every train pulls up to a depot and you change crews. I mean, we're being transported all the time. And that's just one example of how little the general public knows about the operation of railroads, and that's probably, you know, a lesson for us is to get that education out there and let people know. Charlie.
Charlie with the AFL-CIO here in Iowa. Thank you for being here, first of all. I guess I'm kind of curious about what was the political reaction in Canada after this happened. I mean, I had watched Jim spin his wheels, not for lack of effort. He's worked his butt off to try and get a lot of good safety legislation passed here, and even in the Republican-controlled House, the Speaker pro tem is a member of Jim's union, and we can't get anything going on these sorts of things. This is, I don't mean it exactly this way, but does a town need to blow up in Iowa for us to actually get anything done here?
Yeah.
I mean,
It's funny. I know exactly what you're saying, and there was one, you know, there was Cassandra, to give this delinquent railroad company the permission to operate with single-person crews caused a lot of reaction within the department. Certainly within the Quebec regional office, they were furious because they knew the record of this company. And so there was a lot of protests internally. The steel workers were in bargaining at the time, and they were presented by the company with the single-person crews, and they were reacting against it. And then they were told at a certain point that this is being decided outside of collective bargaining. So it's not for you to decide whether this goes through or not. And what they managed in the end to negotiate was no job cuts. The inspectors union formally petitioned the Minister of Transport not to give permission to this company. So kind of that was all happening, and I mean, when it happened, yeah, there was kind of panic, and they were out there, you know, saying, you know, before I say that, there was one particular Cassandra, because it speaks to your point, and he was a senior employee in the transport department, and his specialty was tank car design, and he was recognized as an authority, and he'd been, you know, advocating for years against, in favor of more safety in transporting dangerous goods, and he basically wasn't listened to within. And he said, and he told, because I spoke to him afterwards, but he told a reporter from one of the major newspapers in the months leading up to it, he said, there's going to have to be a major accident before they actually act. And when it happened, and I interviewed him, and he said, in French, he said, "Ça y est, it's happened." And it was, you know, I mean, for him, he only been, they had retired him. He had been in the job over 30 years, and they kind of thought, well, his job was superfluous. There was austerity going on. They were cutting. There was willful blindness to dangers. Him and his whole team that were working on these safety issues, tank car issues, they were all retired. Afterwards, yeah, the government was panicking. The minister of transport at the time, who was, you know, he was on the front lines, and it turned out he was pretty tone deaf in terms of his reaction, and he really angered a lot of people, especially when he came and talked with the town people. He didn't communicate a sense of empathy, only a sense that, you know, the government had done all the right things. So he was kicked out within 10 days, and they put someone in there who was a much better communicator and who managed that communications crisis. And that's what they did. And they, you know, they put in, as I said, they prohibited safety person crews. They committed to strengthening and tightening the train securement rules, key trains and key routes, better emergency response measures, still inadequate, and still problems with securement. There was pushback, but so, you know, they created a sense that put a lot of money into reconstruction. That's another whole story. But the federal government and the provincial government, this is a federal jurisdiction, just like it is, just like it is here, put a lot of money in to the town for reconstruction and rebuilding. You know, so all of those kinds of things were done, and then the government has changed hands, and, you know, the government that's there now is the Liberal government, the Trudeau government. They continued to do things like accelerate the timetable for the removal of the DOT 111s, and then the removal of its successor, which were CPC 1232s, and so forth.
Bruce, can you explain what those designations are for? Because I think most people probably wouldn't know what you're referring to.
Well, you could probably do it better than I. I'll start, and you can come in. But the DOT 111s, which were the cars in the Lac-Mégantic crash, they were considered a pop can on wheels, and both the NTSB and the Transportation Safety Board in Canada said they were unsafe for carrying dangerous goods. In 2011, the AAR came up with a stronger design called the
AAR is
the Association of American Railroads.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought that was an acronym that you knew. So they came up with a bit of a stronger design, but it was, you know, it was voluntary, and they, you know, gradually, it wasn't until it happened that they actually got serious about removing or a new design and improving that subsequent design with head shields and top protections and a thicker shell. But in the retrofitted version, and that's the one that punctured and spilled in Iowa, it's still a thinner shell, so it clearly is not doing the job. in terms of protecting in the case of a spill, at least for the retrofitted version. I haven't heard of any crashes and spills of dangerous goods with the new version. But it'll give you a sense of and then it's always the time and distance and memories fade kind of syndrome, and we've seen it happen. It's not the first time it's happened.
I just want to get this straight. So you're saying, and I need to know, is there any way to stop this train? Say they go to one-man cruise. This dude's the Exxon Valdez captain. He gets drunk. He passes out. What's stopping this train? Is it just cruising down the track on autopilot? Or?
Well, someone is better. I can start, but if it had PTC, which is like a remote satellite-based remote control system to stop unwanted movement, that could stop it theoretically in some cases. But other than that, I don't know. I should just kind of footnote in export. There's a lot of oil by rail on the tracks now. The exports from Canada to the U.S. are at record levels, and the Transportation Safety Board in Canada has recorded a 25% increase in accidents involving trains carrying dangerous goods. 25% between 2016 and 2018, and an increase in runaways or unwanted movement since Lac-Mégantic. So I've forgotten that, but why don't you expand on that question?
And to your point, it doesn't even have to be somebody is negligent and drunk. The scheduling that people work under on the railroad, as again we've learned at the University of Iowa Labor Center, is that the fatigue that crews are working under is similar to intoxication. Because we're working such long hours and we're on call 24/7, oftentimes without knowing when we're going to work more than an hour and a half or 2 hours in advance of a shift, there is a level of fatigue there and long schedules, so that that fatigue translates to a situation where crews are sometimes tired, and it speaks to the importance of having two people up there to rely on each other to keep each other safe and attentive and keep going in that situation. In those situations, there are safeguards, but it didn't protect the town of Lac-Mégantic, obviously. What protects the public is just a series of things. There's an alerter, which is a control. It's essentially a button. But we've seen, we've seen through, in Iowa Red Oak, there was a rear-end collision there where the crew was hitting the alerter, but still, just because of kind of an automatic response, was probably fatigued and ended up colliding with the rear end of the train down there by Red Oak, and unfortunately killing those two railroad workers. There is PTC. The companies are continually fighting again for extensions on positive train control. It's been around for decades. Some form of train control has been around on the railroad for decades, and that would significantly help reduce. I'm not saying it eliminate altogether, because I think, again, there's different layers of protection, and unfortunately sometimes they all line up if we're not diligent at all levels, including starting at the top and starting with regulators. I guess I think the safeguards are there. It's the oversight and the policy that needs looked at to make sure that those protections are in place.
You said they don't have very many inspectors either. How do they know that the work is it automated where you see it on a computer or something? Or?
This is a good question. Dave, I don't want to put you on the spot, but Dave Huntley's here with Operation Lifesaver, and he's an FRA inspector. Maybe you can talk about the number of inspectors and what that, again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what's that like in terms of FRA oversight? And FRA, for folks who don't know, is the Federal railroad administration and be sort of the people charged with keeping us
Yeah.
safe on the railroads.
As you said, I'm here for Operation Lifesaver, but my full-time job is with the Federal Railroad Administration. I'm a grade crossing inspector. Before that, I was a hazmat inspector. I was at Greenwich, by the way. Inspector-wise, it's based on the 8 regions across the United States. There are various 5 disciplines, actually 6 now. You've got your track inspector, OP, which is operating practices. You have your hazmat, you have your signal and trade control, and then you have your, I lost my 5th one there, but grade crossing is one. Oh, MP&E, motive power equipment, your cars and locomotives. But they can only do so much. There's thousands of train cars out there, there's thousands of locomotives, and we can only basically spot check. We use a lot of data that we get from railroads, from statistics that we use to identify hotspots. That's where we go to try to focus our attention spots on. So not as many as we'd like to have with anything. You only got so much money and so many inspectors out there, and do with what you can.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi, Sherry.
I was just wondering, with the nuclear waste issues, and if the decision is made in this current environment in our country to transport that nuclear waste, whether it's Yucca Mountain or wherever they decide.
I don't want to scare you, but there is nuclear waste being transported by rail today.
Okay.
And in
what
Canada
is
as well.
being done, and how are people being notified, for example, maybe that this is being transported through their communities?
Pretty
As
secret. I think it's pretty
Spray
secret.
spray paint decided to call it.
If you see a car with a radiation tag on the back, that's how you know.
And it's moving at 70 miles an hour?
I don't have a good answer for you on that one, unfortunately, Sherry. I really don't.
Yeah, I don't either. It's just operating under very, very secret conditions, presumably under, PTC and all of the other. Maybe I just don't know. I hope it is. I hope it's being operated under ultra safe conditions.
So I guess for me, the answer is improving overall rail safety is the biggest safeguard we have there, and making sure that overall we've got safe operating conditions on the whole railroad. But yeah, for people concerned about radioactive waste, there's no easy answer there.
Well, there's also a side argument that perhaps we should not be making it known that there's nuclear waste on those trains.
Yeah.
Well, you just hide it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, you don't want the wrong people to know it's there.
Does anybody else have any questions for Bruce?
I have one last question. Do you guys, down here on Hubble, every time I drive by, you plan that? Or
That is Union Pacific Railroad. That's probably John. I'm going to point the finger at him. That is our railroad. The east side, it does have a lot of rail traffic here in Des Moines. I guess I'd ask, there's the signs in advance of the crossings that kind of warn folks that there is train traffic ahead. Does that help?
Sure.
And I'm getting cues here. Yeah. And do you want to explain what that is you're holding, Dave?
As part of the Federal Railroad Administration and safety of crossings, they came out with what they call the emergency notification system. And this sign is on each and every crossing in the United States, even on private railroad crossings, on the approach, that has a direct phone number to the railroad and a unique DOT number for that specific crossing. We're trying to almost take the place of 911. So any issues, whether it be block crossing, unsafe crossing, rough crossing, whatever, call that number and complain. Now, the FRA does not regulate stop trains, but I do regulate this because this is controlled by federal regulation. They have to document every call they get in, and what they do to counteract or correct that is the default. So call these in, use that number.
And if I can follow up, like you said,
Arms like this.
I don't recommend that, by the way. You mentioned that it's not federally regulated. It is, however, state regulated, and the regulation is fairly lax on that, but it is there, and there can be enforcement for block crossings for significant periods under certain conditions, and so reporting those is key to, and again, you just locally report those to your local authorities, and the only way is to document those. I will say we have to be diligent because that is a regulation on the books here in Iowa that is being fought by the railroad companies. They do want to remove that legislation, not be, especially with the length of trains increasing. They don't want to be burdened by that requirement that crossings not be blocked for certain. I believe it's 10 minutes
Yeah,
that they have.
Iowa State's regulations 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got about 10 minutes if folks want to ask questions, and then I think we're done. But yeah, everybody grab a cookie. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, to Bruce.
Yeah.
What happened to the railroad company and the train crew up there when they went to trial in court?
You mean the locomotive engineer?
Yes.
And you mean after it was over, or after the criminal trial?
Now, what happened to the criminal trial? Was he
Well,
found guilty? Or?
No, I thought you must have missed it, or I must not have communicated it. It was a 4-month trial, and all three were acquitted. I think the most vulnerable was the locomotive engineer. The RTC was also on trial, as well as one of the managers. But they were all acquitted.
RTC?
Sorry, the rail traffic controller.
sweat.
Thank you. The rail traffic controller as well. They were acquitted. Some of them, along with actually some of the executives across the board, were charged and found guilty. Well, they were plea agreements on much lesser charges, violations of the Rail Safety Act or the Fisheries Act, so environmental damage, and so they paid fines. It's not clear whether they paid. In some cases, their insurance companies would have paid. And in some cases they couldn't be compelled to. The defunct, this is bizarre, but the defunct bankrupt company, Montreal, Maine and Atlantic, that 2 months after it went bankrupt, but it was also charged. It was kind of bizarre. No, don't charge the executives, but charge this defunct railroad. And so when the three men were found not guilty, they dropped the charges against the defunct railway. What that would have, there wasn't even a lawyer to defend. So what would that have meant? But they basically said, well, we can't find these people guilty. We might as well just drop the charges. And it was after that in the Quebec legislature, in the province of Quebec, there was a unanimous resolution after that to have a judicial inquiry to answer the raft of unanswered questions. And so Tom Harding, the locomotive engineer, was the only one that actually got a community service jail sentence of 6 months, which I found just inexcusable. But he was, and he did community service, and he still lives in that community. He's a very private guy. I talked to him during the trial, and my colleague Fritz here did as well. But since the trial, he's remained very, very quiet. He hasn't worked. He's under, you can imagine the ongoing trauma. You imagine living with that experience, regardless of whether you were acquitted or not, and just his own sense of responsibility. Because he was, in a railway that promoted a culture of negligence. He was, he was a stellar employee. Yeah, so it's been pretty traumatic for all of them who were, you know, had a role, who were kind of at the other end, and were, you know, where all of those choices were just so restricted, and basically it was a foregone conclusion, and those cheese holes were just, you know, none of them was working in their favor that night.
Fred?
There's a lot more to this story, including the fact that what we have today with the Boeing tragedies and other things that relate to the same question about whether companies can be trusted to do self-regulation or not. But there's a lot more to this specific story than we have any kind of time for here. But we do have copies of his book, so I encourage people, if they are interested, to get a copy of it, because this is a super important story that is not a story from the past, it's a story from right now. We met with the Attorney General a little earlier today, mentioned the fact that one of the industries right here locally that has this issue posed is the pork industry. He said, yeah, we're real involved in that. So you have the same thing, the same story that you've heard here today can play out in a lot of different industries. In the Lac-Megantic case, Ed Burkhardt, the chief executive, that had already been elected by the industry as Railroader of the Year. So nobody was in a position to question whether he was the smartest guy in the room when he said that you could get rid of all these regulations and get rid of all these safety protections. What a difference one day can make from July 5th to July 6th. So I encourage you to learn more about this story.
We do have the copies if you're interested. Thank you all for being here. It's about 5 till. Grab a cookie, everybody, and thank you so much.